In our last lecture, we explored in depth the Dardanelles crisis, the campaign, and its impact upon Winston Churchill, his fall from political influence, and his response to go into the trenches and to fight alongside those men whose lives he was trying to save through this bold strategy of the Dardanelles. The crisis over the Dardanelles weakened fatally the position of Herbert Asquith as Prime Minister. And he was replaced in the aftermath by Churchill's old associate, David Lloyd George, the man who had played such a role in doing Churchill in at the time of the Dardanelles. But it would be Lloyd George who in 1917 would call Churchill back into the government. The public outcry, particularly in the press, over the Dardanelles had been such that a parliamentary committee had investigated it. And finally, all the papers were available to this commission. And Churchill's side could be told. He was brought back to report to it, to testify before it. And when the commission was finished, Churchill was completely cleared. It was absolutely certain, the commission said, that the entire cabinet had been involved, had wanted to go ahead with the Dardanelles, that the chiefs of staff had been in favor of the campaign, that Churchill himself was not to be blamed. But you know, years later, people would still shout out at Churchill as he was giving a speech, "How about the Dardanelles?" And the newspapers would always bring up the Dardanelles as an example of his folly years later. And in fact, when the Allies were working closely with Churchill, when the Americans were during the Second World War, the Dardanelles and the perception of the Dardanelles was a primary reason why Roosevelt and George Marshall in particular were highly skeptical of Churchill's strategic ideas and suggestions. So it lingered on. Why? Why does the lie so frequently triumph over the truth? Churchill said, "Slander moves in 6-league boots," and it does. And don't say that where there is smoke, there is fire. President Kennedy said, "Where there is smoke, there is a smoke machine." And nobody knew better than Adolf Hitler that if you want to slander somebody, you tell the absolute opposite of the truth. You don't build upon a little kernel of truth, you tell the absolute opposite. And so this slander about the Dardanelles stuck to Churchill. But Lloyd George knew Churchill, and Lloyd George had a problem. And that is with the administration of the armaments. That was another public outcry. Generals claimed that offenses failed because there were not sufficient shells. And Lloyd George wanted somebody in charge of munitions who would make sure the shells got there. And he knew what so many other cabinet members refused to admit. Churchill was an extremely good administrator. He got jobs done. And so, against great criticism, tremendous resistance from fellow cabinet members, the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, brought Churchill back and made him Minister of Munitions. And Churchill immediately took a chaotic organization, divided into 50 different bureaus, reorganized it into 12 bureaus, and put businessmen in charge of each of these bureaus. And they got the job done. And the troops began to have more than enough shells. And Churchill could also go back to one of his favorite ideas, the tank. Because you see, already in 1914, looking at the Western Front, this huge line of trenches stretching from the North Sea down to Switzerland, this lunar landscape with barbed wire. How could you get across it? Well, surely there must be a way of building some kind of armored car that could move across that land and the men could follow behind it. Let the armored car punch holes in the barbed wire, blow up the machine guns of the Germans. And so he began, already in 1915, while he was First Lord of the Admiralty, to develop an idea, it's been suggested by several people, of what we would call today a tank. An armored car, but it couldn't be on wheels because those couldn't get over all the shell holes and trenches, so it had to work like a tractor. And so it'd be put on these treads, and Churchill wanted to keep it secret. And so he put out that these men were working on water tanks to be carried to the Middle East. And so it came to be known as the tank. But in the minds of the Army, it was Winston's folly. One more crazy idea. Why, General Haig, who would become a field marshal, who would plan these brilliant campaigns on the Somme and in Passchendaele, knew what you needed to beat the Germans. Break through their center and then send cavalry. Well, that's what Marlborough had done at Blenheim, hadn't he? Let's send cavalry. And he always kept these huge quantities of cavalry in reserve, knowing that sooner or later they were going to be needed. So don't tell him about tanks. And sure enough, as soon as Churchill had to step down from the Admiralty, the first thing his successor did was dismantle the tank project. And so there it lay. Few tanks were made, and Haig was under some pressure to try them, so he did, in a way he knew would make them absolutely useless, make them fail, and then he could say, see, I told you so. But as soon as he was back in charge of munitions, Churchill went back with his tanks. And by the time the war ended, the tank had proved its value, and you must realize the German collapse came very, very rapidly. In March of 1918, the Germans seemed about to take Paris, and it was only in August that their forces began to suffer severe reverses, and it was only with the arrival of a large number of American troops and the American offensive in the Argonne in September and October of 1918 that the Germans collapsed. So 1919 was supposed to be a big year for the war. And Churchill had put together an enormous array of forces, tanks, as well as making sure there were plenty of aircraft, because he had understood the role that they would play. And so as Minister of Munitions, he got the job done. Did it well. And when the war came to an end, Churchill, with his wife, walked through the cheering streets of London. The victory had been won. He held no animosity towards the Germans, that valiant, disciplined, and ruthless race, as he called them. And he would write admiringly, they succeeded on every front. Their science invented terrible mechanisms of death. But is it not enough for all time, Germans? Is it not enough? In war, he said, let us be resolute. In defeat, defiant. In victory, let us have magnanimous feelings. And so he stretched out his hands to the Germans. And so successful was he as Minister of Munitions that Lord George then made him in 1919 Minister for War and Air. Important job. And Churchill's first problem was how to demobilize this vast army. Because the men wanted to go home, and they wanted to go home fast. And his predecessor had developed this very elaborate system, but the basis of it was that if you had a job waiting for you at home, you were demobilized. So if you had been in for 2 days and had a job waiting for you at home, you got to go home. Well, this did not sit well with people who had been there since 1914. And so Churchill came in and set up the very simple procedure, you've served the longest, you go home first. And he said, it was the best thing I ever did. Now, that shows again his care for the ordinary person. Don't you see? These were real men who wanted to get back to their families. And so he saw that it was done. Now, his task was a simple one. In the view of the chiefs of staff of the British military establishment, there would not be another war. The Germans were defeated, battered, and there would not be another war. And so the budget should be used in other ways. And he had the assignment, and he carried it out, to cut the military budget. This meant cutting the Air Force. And he did it. That was his task. He had other tasks as well. And one of them, which would once again prove to so many people how reckless he was, he could recommend how troops that remained in the Army were to be sent around the empire, where they should go. Now, in the view of the Army, he should only carry out their recommendations, but nonetheless, it gave him a certain entree. And he used that entree in the cabinet to say, let us send troops to Russia. Now, the year is 1919. The Bolshevik Revolution is in full swing. And from the outset, Winston Churchill recognize the evil of communism. It is not an alternative economic system. It rests upon the denial of the most fundamental of human rights, the right to property. Can you not understand that? It is not socialism of the variety of our emerging Labor Party. It is a brutal tyranny. He would write of Trotsky and of Stalin that Trotsky was superior to Stalin in intellect, but not in crime. They were both gangsters, and Lenin was the chief gangster. The baboonry, he said, of Bolshevism. And there are armies fighting against it. There are armies led by Russian generals who, if we supply them with munitions and if we send a small critical mass of men, can overthrow the Bolsheviks. They are just hanging on by a thread, and they were. And the cabinet wanted nothing to do with this. The British public wanted nothing to do with it. We have just fought the most terrible war in history. What sane person wants to involve us in more wars? Winston is running amok again. He's a warmonger. He thrives upon war, and he wants to get us in a war with Russia. What can we do in the vast steppes of Russia? Let the Russians sort out their own problems. But don't you see? Churchill understood that that form of isolationism ultimately fails. If you allow evil to entrench itself in one country, then it will come back to you. The Bolsheviks are slaughtering thousands of people. Don't you know they dragged the young officer cadets into the ballroom of the Winter Palace, and they raised up the lid of the grand piano and put their heads under them and smashed them one by one like walnuts? That is what they are doing. They are allowing people to starve to death. Don't you know they're saying, kill all the bourgeois? But Comrade Lenin, who is a bourgeois? Why, look at his soup pot, and if he has a bit of meat in there, shoot him. That's a bourgeois. They are killing people just for who they are. But it fell upon deaf ears. And once again, it cost him much of his political capital. The newspapers hounded him, and the government ultimately did nothing. And the white armies, the armies against the Bolsheviks, would fade away, and communism would be entrenched. And it also cost him much credit with British labor, because the British Labor Party and many British working people saw this as a great fight for the working man, that this was communism, it was being established, and here was Winston Churchill trying to hold it down, just the way he was trying to hold down the labor man. They could not look into the future and see all the horrors. This was a workers' state being created. And besides, some of the finest British intellectuals said how wonderful Bolshevism was. I have been to the future, one said, and it works. But he had proved his value as Secretary for War and Air, and in 1921, he was made Colonial Secretary. That Lloyd George was a clever fellow, because I'm telling you, if there were one really hard ministry in 1921, it was the Colonial Secretary. Not only did he have responsibilities for the whole of the empire, and we must remember that the British Empire reached its height after the First World War. The breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, gave it mandates under the League of Nations in the Middle East, in Palestine, in Iraq. And Lord George also saw to it that the duties of Churchill included Ireland and the Irish problem. So Churchill had two problems, two issues that are still with us so much today: Ireland and the Middle East. And Churchill went out to the Middle East, taking with him as an advisor Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. They were two men made for each other, men of bravery and valor. Lawrence admired Churchill, and Churchill looked upon Lawrence as one of the grandest men he had ever met. There is nothing he couldn't do if he set his mind to it. Churchill said of Lawrence. You see, Churchill is a truly great man, and he is not threatened by excellence. He wants excellence around him. And he takes Lawrence out, even though they don't see eye to eye on the Middle East. Lawrence believes that Britain has very strong commitments to the Arabs, and these would not include a Jewish state. But Churchill, for a long time already, had been, as he would say later, a Zionist. He believed in a homeland for the Jews, and he believed that this must be carved out of Palestine. He understood that this might involve the taking away of land from the Arabs. And as always, he set priorities. And he said, how do I judge this? I say, look what the Jews have done in Palestine. Look how they have begun to create a garden out of a desert. He was a close friend with leading Zionist leaders, and he worked closely with them. He was not popular in countries of the Middle East. In Egypt, he was booed. When he went to Jerusalem, there were threats upon his life. But he believed that the British had committed themselves in 1917, through the Balfour Declaration, to the establishment of a Jewish homeland. And he worked his best to set it in motion. He was opposed by major figures in the government. He was opposed by the army, who put great confidence in the Arab soldiers and in using Arab troops in defense of the empire. But he clung to this belief. He planted a little tree at what would become the Hebrew University. The little tree, when he was handed it to plant, was broken and could not live. He asked for another and planted it. Never give up, he said. And so it would be in 1948. And addressing a Jewish group, he said, I stood with you through the darkest days, when many of the leading men in England were opposed to a Jewish state. I am not about to abandon you now in your hour of glory. And then there was Ireland, a torn and unhappy land just as it is today. But all of it then was under British rule. Queen Victoria had said, and many agreed, I do not think we should give away what is ours. And so all through the latter part of the 19th century, the question of home rule had been a violent issue in British politics. The great Prime Minister Gladstone fell from power for endorsing Irish home rule. The idea that the Irish govern their internal affairs and are part of the empire for military defense and foreign policy. As Minister of War, Churchill had sent troops to Ireland. Already in 1916, there had been a terrible uprising in Ireland during the war, the Easter Rebellion. And then after the war was over, bloodshed on a terrible scale throughout Ireland, political assassinations, and Churchill sent troops who had mustered out of the army. They wore black hats, and they had a brown belt, and they had their khaki uniforms on. They were called the Blacks and Tans. And they shot people dead. The IRA was a terrorist branch, and the Blacks and Tans shot them dead. And armed warfare went on. And now, in his role as colonial secretary, he was given the task of trying to negotiate some kind of arrangement. On the one hand, there were the British Unionists, like Sir Henry Wilson, a brave soldier and utterly committed that all of Ireland would remain British. It was just that simple. It would never be an independent country. It was Britain, just as much as Scotland was. It was part of Britain. And on the other hand, the IRA and the Irish Republicans, who demanded all of Ireland free and independent, a Republic of Ireland. And there would be no compromise. And Churchill sought to bring them together. And he began negotiating with one of the most unlikely of characters, Michael Collins, an IRA gunman. He hated Churchill, hated what Churchill stood for, hated Churchill for bringing in the Blacks and Tans, knew about Churchill's father, who had said, remember, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. The northern counties will fight to keep all of Ireland part of Britain, and they would be right to do so. And there was a price. There was a bounty on the head of Michael Collins. Huge bounty. And yet Churchill said, come to London, talk with me. Come under an armistice. And they met. Collins was a bulldog man like Churchill, very much alike, though he had more hair than Churchill. And Collins just glowered at him. And Churchill said, I hear they have a huge bounty on your head. Collins said, yes, don't you think you put it there? And Churchill said, yes, I did, but let me show you something. And he pulled out the poster that the Boers had put on him, 25 pounds. And he said, look, that's all the Boers thought I was worth. See how much more admiration I have for you? And Collins stuck out his hands, and they shook hands. And they began to negotiate, bringing others in with them. And the only possible compromise was what we still have today, that the 7 northern counties, Northern Ireland, Ulster, would remain part of Britain. And a free state would be established in the rest of Ireland. It would control its own government with its own parliament, but be part of the empire and follow British foreign policy. It was a halfway house, and Ireland could then develop it, as it would do, into becoming a free republic. You'll recall that in World War II, Ireland was neutral. This was the halfway house. And so the agreement was signed, December the 6th, 1921. Churchill and other British ministers, as they signed it, said, this could be our political death warrant. So strong is the feeling against establishing an Irish Free State in Parliament, particularly in the Conservative Party. Michael Collins said, this is my actual death warrant. And so it would be. He would be shot dead a few months later by IRA gunmen, believing that he had betrayed the cause of Ireland. So much resistance was there among the Irish Republicans that battle broke out in Dublin. And Churchill asked the question, Michael Collins was still alive, if you assault the positions in Dublin, are there men who will die for the Irish Free State? That is ultimately the question. And there were. And one of them would ultimately be Michael Collins himself. But an extraordinarily difficult, volatile problem. Again, the smart politician would have said, Prime Minister, I don't want to be Colonial Secretary anymore. I don't want to be in charge of Ireland. That was a sure way to political disaster. But it had to be done. The Irish are an ancient race. They are a parent nation to many of the greatest countries of the world. They have fought with valor on field after field under our Union Jack. Let them go. Be worthy. And so ultimately, both in the Middle East and in Ireland, for good or ill, Churchill, as a statesman, laid the foundations that still exist today. But this is an extraordinary man. It was already an extraordinary career. 1922, over a small incident in the Middle East, in Turkey as a matter of fact, the government of Lord George fell. And the Liberal Party was out. Once again, Churchill was blamed for this small incident. It was a little fortress city called Chinook. The Turks were demanding to take it. There were British troops there. Remember, the Turkish Empire had been divided up. Under the great Kemal Ataturk, the Turks were reestablishing their country. They were determined to drive out all foreign troops. They had driven out the Greeks, they had driven out the French, and they were going to drive the British out. And they were attacking this small fortress, and the cabinet was all in a dither. What are we going to do? We don't have any allies to support us in this, and the soldiers don't want to fight. And Churchill said, beat the Turks and then give them the city, but don't surrender it without fighting. All that warmonger again, and sure enough, the press picked it up. The government collapsed. Churchill did it. Don't you see, he got us in trouble again with his warmongering. No, it is that you should always negotiate from strength. But the government fell, and Churchill had to run again for Parliament. And he was going to run from his seat that he had held for so many years, Dundee in Scotland. And Dundee was a very working-class city. A lot of people were out of jobs after the First World War, the ending of the armaments industry, the shipbuilding. And they were poor, they were depressed, and they wanted little part of Churchill. And the campaign was going to be difficult in 1922. And at the critical moment, as he was about to roll into his campaign at full speed, he had an appendicitis. He was in bed. So Mrs. Churchill, who had just had a little baby, went up there, and the crowd spit on her. Well, she wore pearls and things like that, but they spit on her. And they rocked her car when she tried to drive away. And Winston came up out of his sick bed, and if you've ever had an appendectomy, it hurts for about 2 weeks, very painful. And he was brought up there and tried to sit and give a speech, and they yelled at him, guess what? How about the Dardanelles? The Dardanelles could have saved thousands of lives. I glory in the Dardanelles. Warmonger, how about shooting down miners? You want to shoot us down? And so they shouted out. And he lost. And tragically of all, he lost to a prohibitionist, somebody in favor of outlawing whiskey. Most terrible thing he could imagine. And I woke, he said, to find myself without a seat, without a party, without an appendix. For indeed, the old Liberal Party had all but collapsed. British politics had become far more polarized. The Conservatives, now the Labour Party. The Labour Party that was bent upon a socialist program. They had begun as a small branch of the Liberal Party, the Labour Committee, but they had now become a major force in British politics. And for the old Liberal point of view, based on free trade and helping to give welfare benefits, there was increasingly little room in the British world. And from 1922 to 1924, Churchill would lose 2 more elections. He'd be out of Parliament that whole time. And also suffer the crushing blow of the death of his little daughter, Marigold, the Duckadilly. Just a toddler. She caught what was thought to be strep throat. It turned into meningitis, and she died. And Churchill's wife gave a cry like a wounded animal and never fully recovered. So terrible blows. But in 1924, he stood again under the title that was really his, an independent constitutionalist, and was elected. And then, with the Liberal Party collapsing, joined the Conservative Party again. Further alienated people in the Liberal Party and making people in the Conservative Party think he was nothing but a political opportunist. And what an opportunity he got, because he now was made by the new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, Chancellor of the Exchequer, the very office his father had once held. He still had the robes that had been his father's. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Secretary of the Treasury, was thought to be the most important position leading to the prime ministership. It was the stepping stone. When Lord Randolph had fallen from his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer, a very presumptuous young man showed up at the doors of Lady Randolph and said, "I want the robes of office." And she said, "I am keeping them for my son." And sure enough, he would wear these robes. And for 5 years, matching the term of office of great figures like Pitt, he would serve as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He would follow the advice of the leading experts of the time. He would take Britain back onto the gold standard. His speeches were a masterpiece, holding the Parliament for 2.5 to 3 hours, going over budgetary figures. And Stanley Baldwin would write at the end of one of them, "I don't like to use the word brilliant, It sounds too much like brilliantine to me, the stuff you slick your hair down with. But if I may use it in its pristine sense, your speech was brilliant. I want to shake your hands with both of mine. And so once again, it seemed the peak was in sight, and all his talents, energy, and genius could serve his country at the highest level.